My name is Michael Kunichik. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Russian and Slavic Studies, and I want to thank Christina very much for asking me to do this. Our first speaker today is Oksana Sarkisova, who is going to be reading, who's giving a paper, Archival Eye, Dziga, Vertov, and the Curated Image Archives. Oksana comes to us as a permanent research fellow at Central European University. And I'll just say that her work on Dziga Vertov is something that I've been following very closely, and it's a great pleasure to have her here. So I'm looking forward to hearing this. Please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone. Greetings, and many thanks to Christina and Emma for organizing this event. It's wonderful being here, not only because it was a little bit adventurous trip, but also because it's a fantastic opportunity to actually see books that I've new turned into people. And I'm looking forward to today because I will have a great chance to actually see some of you whom I've been reading before, and that's a wonderful, very magic moment, and also see, of course, some of the old friends who are always an inspiration and a pleasure to see. So I'll be talking to you about 4 different films, and it might be necessarily patchy as I was trying to compress my presentation. I'm going to show you a few clips, and I apologize if that's going to be a little bit over the assigned limit, but you can stop me at any moment and make me signs if you've already had enough. So I'll start with Dziga Vertov indeed, and with his idea of a factory of facts, which he proposed in 1926. The factory of facts that would ensure the fast, efficient construction of films that do away with narrative crunches and historical reconstructions. Professing superiority of the camera eye over that of humans, he considered film to be most appropriate modern medium of communication and highlighted Kino-Eye as a new method for unplayed features. While Vertov developed his Kino-Eye method as a way of structuring a world of chaos and ascribing it a meaning through observation of the everyday flow of life, theorists of the literature of fact praised another filmmaker, Vertov, for her use of archival material and her method of using long sequence montage. They saw her montage films as a proper way to make use of film footage, which was deemed the material for the future. And the opposition of Shub and Vertov was very powerfully exemplified by Mikhail Yempolsky's article, film of second-hand footage. Grigory Baltansky perpetuated these views. He was one of the masterminds of early Soviet newsreel when he said that the newsreel would, quote, again and again be revived, broken down into its constituent parts, and presented to us in other combinations, unquote. This early Soviet debate, nourished on formalist literary concept as well as physiological and ethnographic research, was concerned with issues of disciplining the vision, developing an ideologically proper gaze and naturalizing a particular way of seeing. A special role was played not only by men with a movie camera, but also by women with scissors, as editing was considered a female profession at the time. The ideological recycling started with the presupposition that any film, including newsreels and nonfiction, was not a value-free record. Alexander Lemberg, Vertov's cameraman and long-term friend, recalled Vertov's early ideas about the newsreel as a screen document, as, quote, screen document that powerfully enters the viewer's consciousness, making the viewer come up with certain predetermined conclusions, unquote. The early Soviet debate on the significance of archives and archival film footage gains new relevance today with yet another archival turn. According to Marianne Duane, the archive today is seen as, quote, a wager about the future, a future screening, a future interpretation. The artifact's significance is a function of what it will have meant. And I would like to say that I think that what it will have meant was actually always the question. It's not just something that we've got concerned with recently. In my presentation, I will consider Vertov's views evolving from ethnographic cataloging in a 6th part of the world towards practices of self-archiving in 3 songs of Lenin, and I will use John McKay's translation of that title. So I'll talk about 3 songs of Lenin, not about Lenin. The second part of my presentation will trace Vertov's legacy and socialist visual heritage in the montage films that refashion the interpretative horizon of cinematic socialism and create new versions of effective history with the help of amateur film archives. For comparison, in the second part, I will briefly analyze Peter Forgaj Kadar's Kiss and Vitaly Mansky Private Chronicles monologue. So first, to the cataloging in Vertov's work. His interest with lists as an epistemological principle of the Kino-Eye method emerged already in the first still theoretical exercise he undertook with a group of Kinoks sometime between 22 and 24, composing thematic etudes, hands, legs, and eyes. All of them were principally open or infinite structure, or as Ernst van Affen put it, they relied on, quote, principle of etc., and are characterized by ultimate expandability. But rather than embracing the totality of eyes, the list, and you see here a beginning of the eye list, which is much longer, it has 41 positions altogether. This list contrasts normal and particular and employs an eccentric collection principle, assembling cases which represent altered, obstructed, estranged, or altogether blocked vision. Vertov's interest in eccentric visual attraction made another early proponent of nonfiction cinema, Vladimir Yerafeev, called his method cinematographic Kunstkammer, disapproving of what he called headless arrangement of disconnected themes. But what appeared as a random survey in Kino-Eye acquired the meaning in Vertov's films, and very different meanings. And Christina wrote in her monograph about Stride Soviet and the use of hands in a particular episode. I will concentrate on the sixth part of The World, 1926 production, which also relied on multiple lists, organized geographically, primarily geographically. This film was commissioned by state trade monopoly, Gostorg, for the promotion of the state trade, but it became something very different. It became kind of a senior race across the USSR, and it turned into a visual catalog of the Soviet Union. It was described as a monumental, epic, lyrical, poetic, Michael also wrote about this, vision of the Soviet Union. The film assembled the footage of several cameramen into a single visual fabric. The camera, and by extension, the mechanized eye of the observer, is the primary unifying element of this ambitious global cine race. IC announces the entry title of the opening aerial shot. The universal optical domination, a global vision, placed the camera in the omnipotent position, structuring and unifying principle at the same time. The film demonstrates the totality of cinematographic surveillance, penetrating both the land of the capital as well as the new Soviet land. Here we see some frame grabs from the first part of sixth part of The World, which shows the land of the capital, and you see a list of entry titles that accompanied it. So the land of capital, and we can see here hands and legs coming up again as a structuring principle. The land of capital is constructed as a visual enumeration of bourgeois activities, primarily leisure, which contain multiple repetitions. The image of the Soviet Union, by contrast, was showed as a site of spatial variety, economic diversity, cultural richness, also through creation of multiple lists, both highly determinant and open-ended. And here I would like to again quote Van Affen, who pointed out that lists, quote, seem to miss the possibility of rendering subjective vision, unquote. Indeed, although Vertov's lists are presented by the first-person account of the invisible godlike observer, the non-character-bound focalization in this film strengthens the distance between the observer and the observed, between I and you. Vertov's film was produced in the heyday of indigenization policy, which Francine Hirsch identified as a crucial moment for the, quote, conceptual conquest of lands and people. The heterogeneity of the Soviet Union is reflected in Vertov's logic of presenting a totality of Soviet citizens, comprising a sort of catalog of the people of the USSR, embraced by the filmmaker's total vision. Here you see the entry title list from a longer fragment, and I'm only going to show you a little part, which here I marked with red. So now I'll just show you a little clip. And I'll translate the intro titles as we go. Tatars, you, Burats, Uzbeks, Kalmyks, Hakas, okay, I'll stop here, though it's a longer fragment and it has very nice rhythm, but ethnographic taxonomy is the primary basis for structuring this list, which, however, contains also other classification principles reminiscent of a certain Chinese encyclopedia described by Borges in his essay, The Analytical Language of John Wilkins, which was so detrimental to Foucault's familiar landmark of thought. And the whole transformation of epistemic classifications. Along with nationality, Vertov lists localities on Pichora River, age, practices, with occasional markers of exoticism reinforced in the entry titles. You who use your feet to do laundry, you who are eating the venison raw, you playing boat polo. This visual all-Soviet catalog also includes the audience watching the film in the cinema hall, featuring a self-reflexive gesture. And here we can see the taxonomic drive, which was also so powerfully reflected and written about by Paula Ahmad in her work, which was already mentioned by Christina. The episode reverses a traditional power axis as the minorities are introduced as masters and owners, but at the same time exemplifies taxonomic impulse of Vertov's work. This list of nationalities is intentionally open, allowing the viewer to imagine a growing community. At the same time, it appears appearing as part of the Soviet project. It acquires significance as a unity, and also relationally, each unit becomes representative of totality. This unity of mosaic word is created through montage, making the structure of a film a perfect example of Vertov's interval theory. The image of the Soviet Union appears to be a fully surveyed and structured entity. It is in this sense that we can understand Vertov's claim that this film was more than a film. It was the next stage after the concept of cinema itself, unquote. His following films further expanded and experimented with the ideas of catalog and unity, but I would like to move ahead to the 1934 release of Three Songs of Lenin, which I believe exemplifies a very different understanding and use of both listing and the archives. It was commissioned by Mezra Pomfilm for the 10th anniversary of Lenin's death, and I'm not going now into the details of different versions and the whole story of editing and re-editing. John McKay wrote wonderful research on that, and now we have a DVD release which allows us to trace various versions of these copies, but I'll speak about it as if we're talking about a single film. Structured as 3 songs, the film monumentalized the life and deeds of Lenin in a hagiographic account featuring the life, death, transfiguration of a sacralized leader. It demonstrates the emergence of Soviet identity generated by various medial interactions, creating new forms of connectivity and collectivity through constant circulation of visual and oral ideological messages, and primarily the figure of the leader. The film makes ample use of visual otherness of the Soviet subjects, but avoids introducing them in ethnic terms. The first song uses the first-person narrative, "My face was in a black prison," which, in John McKay's words, was, quote, arguably the closest thing to a character to be found in any major Vertov's film, unquote. This character is created by fusing images of various women from Central Asia and the Caucasus, whose biographies are shown merging into a single song of an emancipated female. The mechanism through which the change occurs and affects the whole Soviet population is a mechanism of collective emotional experience in which the archive plays a central role. The underlying motive of second song is mourning, which is shown as a mediated participation in the commemorative ceremony following Lenin's death. The song opens with a panning shot over a hall of urban-dressed women sitting in a silent, pensive concentration. Extreme close-ups of meditative sad eyes are edited together with Lenin's funeral ceremony taken from Kino-Pravda 21. This footage is not a flashback, but it's a timeless present. In this editing sequence, Lenin's funeral ceremony changes its status from a newsreel to an archival record. And a brief clip from the 3 songs of Lenin with a totally wrong soundtrack. It is important to emphasize that we deal here with a case of self-archiving. Vertov was very adamant about emphasizing the specificity and authorship of Kino-Pravda as opposed to other newsreels. For him, the newsreel was to play a very concrete function in the present. Thus, Kino-Pravda issues are geographically expansive, emphasizing the flat and non-hierarchical structure of scene races of the camera. But the footage taken and edited into 3 songs of Lenin is anonymized and uncredited. It changes its status from an actuality, the reality at second hand, to the reality of second hand, which is unique on the one hand and capable of generating new meanings on the other. The editing turns the geographically and temporally remote participants of the commemoration into witnesses constituting a single community through the emotional participation in the mediatized spatial temporal event. This new idea of simultaneity was described by Benedict Anderson as a new form of a, quote, solid community moving steadily down or up history, unquote. Vertov achieves a supranational unity with the help of the omnipresent camera eye as well as radio and print sequences in multiple languages. The unique archival image of Lenin's funeral becomes a unifying foundation in the construction of Soviet identity. This self-archiving reflects a changing attitude towards the footage, which increasingly emerges as a source of authenticating the narratives. At the same time, it demonstrates a growing importance of a subjective and effective relationship with the footage. In 3 songs of Lenin, Vertov argued that the total immersion into a new media universe creates new Soviet subjects. It generated identification in a participatory mode, which shaped generations of those growing up within the Soviet system of coordinates, which were produced and circulated by turning newsreel into archive. The power of archival material in signing historical depth and a unique status has a lasting legacy in post-socialist re-evaluations of the period. And I would like to now turn very quickly to 2 examples, which are drawing on Vertov's legacy, but also reworking it in a very creative way. And the first of them is a work by Peter Forgac, a Hungarian experimental filmmaker and visual artist, who focuses and works primarily with home film and video of the short 20th century in Hungary, primarily, but not exclusively. He combines his role of filmmaker and archivist himself because he created and curated the private film and video archive, as well as used it in his own films. Actually, his video art installations, Letters to Afar, was hosted by City Museum of New York and just closed recently. Was on display only a few weeks ago. This installation, just like the earlier works, draws on the visual energy and poetics of amateur film footage. While several of Forgács films were acclaimed internationally, I would like to draw attention to a less-known film in the private Hungary and private socialist series, which started in 1988. Film historian Balázs Varga described Forgács's work with found footage, producing, quote, the double effect of intellectual distance and emotional intimacy. And I would like to explore this unstable boundary in Kadar's Kiss, which was made in 1997. And what interests me in relation to Kadar's Kiss is how private archives, described as repetitive, performative, and containing only a narrow range of possibly marked life episodes, could actually translate to broader commentary, refashioning the image of the socialist period. As opposed to most of the films in Private Hungary series, here he doesn't deal with a particular family story, but works towards creating a collective visual unconscious of socialism. Varga described Kadar's Kiss as a grotesque, sarcastic, and eclectic film. Behind the deconstruction and the rhetoric, we can observe the intention to unveil the uniqueness of private lives. Forgács works here with the footage that he has, just as Vertov proposed to build using the film bricks for constructing new narratives. And we have here an assemblance of both photographic and moving images into a single narrative that changes the hierarchical relationship of private and public narratives and cancels the tension between the personal time and historical time, which so many of his other private Hungary films emphasized. The public history is not imposed on the private memories, but the former is constituted by the latter, pointing to the absence of the core. We also don't find in this film the strategies of repersonalization, but like in other films in the Private Hungary series, Forgács does not use period images in a historicist tradition of illustrations, but to further his historiographic argument. He shows us how the socialist subjects generated a system of references which accommodated desires at a price of profound and irreversible compromises. The materiality of the socialist experience emerges from a collage and yet another list of references shown as traces found in private archives, official newsreels and film extracts, as well as radio broadcasts ranging from weather forecasts to Kadar speeches and popular period songs. Together they create a social fabric marked by silence, repressed desire, and a contrast of private eroticism with public lies presented as political pornography. And I would like to show you a brief clip from
To communists personally, the opinion about and concept of communists has varied repeatedly over the last 40 years. Why do I raise this? Because the communist, when hungry and wanting to eat and struggling to have food on his plate, he does it righteously. But he also struggles because he cannot eat a spoonful heartily if another is starving. And the communist should be like this. He does not need to be above his fellow men, but nor under them. We have to deserve the name of man. I trust that the tasks will be completed. What's more, if we work well, those objectives can be achieved before date set and can be achieved at a level higher than set.
You've heard the speech of Kadar in the background. Kadar's kiss is not a linear story. As the chronological markers change, the same footage is repeated, undermining the idea of a linear progression of time. The repetitiveness of images strengthens the motives, which becomes the title of another cult film in Hungary, The Time Stands Still. The emergence and dissolution of the socialist subject is paralleled by the imagery of destruction of the national theater, framing the destruction and creation opposite in cultural terms and introducing motifs of surface and depth, public facades and secluded interiors. The opposition is traced also in contrasting public and private festive occasions, from Christmas to May 1st parades. The mediatization of the socialist universe here, like in earlier Vertov's example, is emphasized by the recurrent presence of radio broadcasts and TV sets, which enters the private space of the citizens, subverting the clear-cut private-public opposition. And although the idea to present a composite portrait to collective experiences was united by the figure of political leader, like in Three Songs of Lenin, Forgac is far from presenting Kadar as the core symbol of Hungarian socialism personally. Rather, he wants to show the absence of the core, the emptiness behind the facade. The director emphasizes the rupture between the socialist past and the present, from where he tells his story, and he looks at the socialist culture as a remote other planet, but nevertheless very affectionately. And here I would like to contrast this approach to another film by Vitaly Mansky, which very similarly recycles and reuses the private amateur footage in his film monologue, Private Chronicles, made in 1999, where he works in a very different way, in an opposite way, one can say, editing a generic story of the last Soviet generation from a multiplicity of Soviet-time private archives. The film protagonist, introduced as the last Soviet generation, representative of the last Soviet generation, is born on April 11, 1961, and is represented as the embodiment of collective Soviet experiences. Like in Forgac films, the individual donors of film footage are not introduced and are made autonomous. But Mansky consciously emphasizes his relationship with Vertov. His studio is called Vertov Studio, and he is making very straightforward references in his interviews and his films as well to Vertov. And I will be very brief with talking about this film because I think I'm already abusing your attention. He merges the individual and utterly private stories into a generic story of a collective Soviet self. Speaking on behalf of the last Soviet generation, an off-screen voice tells the viewers the story of a simple Soviet man. The mosaic reconstruction of a Soviet Bildungsroman seeks to embrace the most generic generational experiences, as well as to present the story of private ups and downs behind the monochrome Soviet facade. In this macro reflection, the narrator combines the role of a commentator and a historical figure. And just a very brief fragment from Private Chronicles, and then I'll conclude.
Это я.
That's me.
Для начала апреля погода не бог весть что.
Weather is not so good for the
Могла бы
beginning
быть
of
и
April.
лучше. Но по сравнению со всем увиденным мной остальным,
But compared to
на
what I've
погоду
seen,
было жаловаться
to all
грех.
the other things I've seen, I shouldn't
Остается
complain
только
about the
удивляться
weather.
искреннему восторгу моих
I can only be
родителей.
surprised about the
Ведь у них
happiness
даже
of my
нет денег на
parents.
такси. Но цели
They don't even
ясны,
have money for a taxi,
задачи
but they walk
определены, и
across the
меня
whole town
несут
by
через
foot.
весь город на руках, пешком. А уже через год на этом месте вырастут
And in a year here
красавицы-хрущёвы.
there will be beautiful
Дворцы с
Khrushchev
9 квадратными
5-story
метрами
buildings with 9 square
на
meters
каждого
per
советского
person.
человека.
Soviet happiness.
А на этой вечеринке
This is where my
познакомились мои
parents met.
родители. Это мой отец,
This is my
это
father,
мама,
And my mother.
По-моему, она была очень красивая.
I think my mother was beautiful. Okay. Starting from this tiny little square on a black background, the film frames gradually growing, drawing the viewer in and emphasizing the power of the visual media to reanimate the past and bring it closer, immersing the viewer into this experience. The time gaps becomes filled with personal memories, establishing an emotional connection between the past and the present. Like Forgach, Mansky tames and subverts the immediate nostalgic potential of the footage by estranging it, but it comes from the anachronistic commentary that narrator has about his childhood and his coming of age. In this sense, Private Chronicles goes beyond a mere inventory of people and events. Through an imaginary personal narrative, fragmented experiences acquire a new unity and an unequivocally detrimental commentary. A simple Soviet man supplants a multiplicity of possible voices by a single interpretation. Although the film professionals criticized the film for incongruities, it had a very clear political message. It was released shortly before the presidential elections in 2000, where an unknown politician, Vladimir Putin, was to compete with the Communist Party, still commanding a broad circle of supporters, and that secured the film a prominent place in TV broadcasts and as a subtle campaign statement. So Vertov's Kino-Eye problematized the relationship between the reality and its image, but at the same time it professed its value as a document. As the works discussed here demonstrate, it is futile to attempt to predetermine and seal the possible range of the meanings of the footage. At the same time, the dream of boundless interpretative flexibility of archival material, as well as an endless plasticity of the past, is itself an illusion, oblivious to the power of the naturalized modalities of seeing. The film fabric stores its film bricks for future employment, for future recycling, but it uses pre-existing templates for construction. I was trying to demonstrate the Vertovian visual legacy in reconstructing the socialist past as a subjective and effective memory, and to analyze the emergence of the post-socialist re-evaluations of socialist experiences from the image of community to the dissolution of the system of references. And in this sense, the construction of a socialist subject can never be considered completed. Thank you so much for your attention.
The question that I have speaks to the specificity of Vertov's archival practice, because for me there are a couple of things that really distinguish what he was doing from what other archival-related practitioners are doing, and I think in this regard he's very different from Forgach. And that has to do with the fact that he is producing footage that he, from the beginning, as you've mentioned and others have written about, understands as being of potential use in a future archival remediation. So he's actually producing footage, as far as I understand it, in a sense that anticipates its reuse and repurposing in the future. He's making films and he's shooting footage in a manner that's really unique from other people during this time. And there's only a few other examples where we have people shooting footage with this hyper-consciousness of its potential to be remediated in that way. And it's one of the reasons why Vertov was so important for my thinking with the Khan Archive, because the Khan Archive cameramen were doing it, but they never get to theorising it and then accomplishing it in the way that Vertov does. So I was wanting to hear a little bit more about how you think that his initial and exceptional relation to film as fact, film as potential brick, then moves into what he does when he's then going back and reusing his footage, because he has a much tighter, intimate relationship with the footage than, say, someone like Forgach does, who's removed from the footage in so many ways. There's historical distance, he isn't the producer of the footage, etc. So Vertov has this very intimate, profoundly intimate relationship with the footage that he's producing. And then this gets me to the second part, and this is more a question that I don't know anything about and would love to learn more about, and I've found out a little bit about it from what I've read from scholars of Vertov. I'd love to know a little bit more about the ratio of how much of the footage he uses in the two films that you mentioned was his, and what was the state of the actual archives and or collections or vaults in which he's extracting the footage from. So I would love to hear anything that you or others might know about the actual state of the storage of the film and how he was able to access it, because the messy details involved in finding film also then speaks to the utopian ideas that he had at the moment where he was making the film. So I'd just like to hear a little bit more, if anyone knows about the state of the collections, archives from which he was extracting these pieces that then get remediated into the two films you mentioned. So one part
maybe
of the
we'll Oksana answer and then
okay.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think these are great and very broad questions, and they really require a longer discussion. That, given the time constraints we have, what I would like to say about the intimate relationship, I hope it didn't sound like I was trying to say that they're actually identical, all the filmmakers, in a way they're dealing with their footage. What I was trying to emphasize is that, of course, I agree that Vertov is unique and special, but we also cannot, I think, treat him as a sort of compact filmmaker with one type of approach to the footage. I think he actually evolves in a way he sees his footage and in a way he works with the footage. And he is, yes, having very intimate relationship with the footage, but he's also using a lot with he's also working a lot with found footage. And also the footage that was sort of shot for him on his commission was not always the footage that he would have wanted to use. And I mean, his multiple, you know, diaries and other entries there containing endless complaints about actually not having the footage that he wanted and him having to work with whatever he's got. So in that sense, maybe the difference, we shouldn't idealize in a way the working conditions in which these filmmakers worked. And that relates to the second question that you were asking of, you know, him kind of using and reusing his footage and how much of that stock was there available for him. Also the storing conditions and the kind of his mastery over the films that were released was not total and was not complete. So it was actually not very easy and not, you know, perfect archival situation at the time. So in that sense, we can say that even the filmmakers, or probably maybe even more filmmakers in the early times, they were struggling with very patched and with very inconsistent archival structures that they were generating as they went along. What was very important for me to emphasize in this contrast between Six Part of the World and Three Songs of Lenin is I think that there is a very strong emotional, affective aspect which emerges in a later film, something which is not present there, I would say, in the early kind of cataloging structure that he's building in a Sixth Part of the World. And in that sense, I would argue that we shouldn't think of Vertov as a filmmaker with a single vision which is, you know, unchanged or which is stably there. That was important for me because I think that that effective relationship with the footage later resurfaces in the works that are trying to refashion that footage in the 1990s in the post-socialist period. And in this sense, yes, Forgac is not filming his own material, he's not commissioning it, or he's not, in that sense, he's not a filmmaker. He's, you can say, he's an editor or he's a creator of films. He makes them really by composing, but he also works with this effective relationship that the donors and the people who generate that footage had, and his own effective relationship, which are not necessarily in synchron. So there is a tension between the types of relationship to the material, but I think his films are very conscious about that, much more than what Mansky tries to do, because what Mansky tries to do is he tries to impose on us his own vision, completely eliminating everything that kind of went into the individual footages that he then edits together. I'm not sure if I covered all that could be said on that issue, but...
John?
Just picking up on this a bit. Oh, sorry, yeah, thank you, yeah. Just picking up on what Paula and Oksana were saying, I mean, yeah, these are huge questions. First of all, I mean, the first thing to remember about, let's just start with the Kino-Pravdas, right, and even the Kino-Nedelias, which are the earlier ones. Newsreel films were always, virtually always themselves, compressions, condensations of actualities. Okay, so there's already a pre-existing actuality film, that is to say a short, non-fictional film that lies behind them. And that's the case already with the Kino-Nedelia films. We know actually which films, we don't necessarily have the films, but we know which films he was using then. And in the case of the Kino-Pravdas, for instance, he says himself that he said there's no footage that he actually shot originally for any of them until Kino-Pravda number 10. That's not totally true, obviously, in part because he appears in the first one, actually, very briefly, and so on. So, and there's a few things like that. So there's that question, that's something to keep in mind, that these films sort of act as archives for each other in a certain way. The most sort of extraordinary example of this is, maybe some of you have heard of Albrecht Bloom's In the Shadow of the Machines, which is a film that re-edits stuff from Vertov's film The 11th Year and totally inverts the meaning of it. What was sort of celebratory of sort of machine culture in Vertov becomes negative and sort of all about, you know, machines oppressing people and blah, blah, blah. But the thing is that that footage doesn't exist in Vertov's film. So the film actually, it acts as an archive preserving stuff that, for whatever strange reason, is not extant in any Soviet print of the 11th year. So it's the funny way that these different kinds of objects can sort of function archivally and preservationally for one another. And just to sort of pick up, just to reaffirm what you were saying about 1/6 of the world, Oksana, I mean, that, indeed, he was not satisfied with a lot of the camera work on there, and that's one of the reasons why that film has that incredibly wonderful sort of bumpy look, right? It's just sort of one shot to the next, different textures, different qualities, like clearly some of it taken from like dupe negatives and this sort of stuff, right? In contrast to the next films, 11th Year, Man with the Movie Camera and so forth, right, which are a lot smoother. They look a lot more, because they're shot basically. He really was controlling that in a different kind of a way. Anyway, I could go on, but I'm not going to go on. That's enough. Probably more questions.
Thank you, John. It's a great comment, and I'd just like to reinforce that indeed there is much more kind of archival depth to Vertov work with the footage, and it starts much earlier. So this kind of opposition of the two films is just an example out of a much broader body of work. Thank you.
Maybe one last question, if there is.
Can I have it? Thank you for the presentation, Oksana. And since we were talking about Vertov a lot in connection with these films, I was wondering if we are comparing a filmmaker such as Peter Forgach, and also you showed some images from the Mansky films, if we are comparing them to early Soviet cinema, wouldn't it be also a good idea to compare Forgach with Esther Shub? Because Vertov was dealing with the more recent footage shot for a specific purpose, right, to be used in the news. And Shub was dealing with the footage shot by a previous generation. So it is, in that sense, it is more of a found footage, similar to the way that Forgach was working with his. Of course, the narrative that these two filmmakers were creating was different, but I would be interested to hear your ideas about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Masha, for your question. I think we can absolutely expand the field, and we can also expand it in the post-socialist context, because of course there is a very active revival of different traditions of working with the archival footage. So I think Shub, yes, she should have been part of this presentation if I were not worried to run over an hour with this talk. But at the same time, I think the legacy of Shub can be traced more powerfully in other archival works that are created in the post-socialist period. And I was not bringing in works by Sergei Loznitsa, for example, who would be, I think, very, very powerfully exemplifying the tradition, the kind of Shubian tradition in working with the long sequence edited footage and so on. So I think the picture is actually much broader than what I could possibly cover in this presentation.